Hello and welcome to a LightWave 3D user training video. The topic of this video will cover how to set up the network render controller and your network nodes on a Windows 10 environment so that you can utilize multiple workstations to render out the images in your scene files. I will be setting up the service type as a Windows service using a domain account. And there are three parts of this video. The first part will be how to set up the network render controller on the workstation. There are 6 steps involved in this process outlined here. At any point, you can jump to the timeline to look at specific steps. The second part of this video will look at how to set up the network node on a workstation. This also has 6 steps outlined here. The final part of this video will then look at the configurations in LightWave that you need to do in order to prepare your scenes for network rendering. So with these steps in mind, let's get going. So here we are at the desktop, and LightWave 2019.1.2 has already been installed, but nothing else has been configured for network rendering. In this environment, I'm going to be using my domain account to provide security to all of the nodes that need to access the server. In this case, it's this Windows desktop. So there's a few items that I need to look at here from a permissions perspective. If I go onto the C drive and click on the Newtek folder, one of the first things that we need to do is set permissions on this folder. And this will apply not only to this version, but previous versions that may be installed or additional versions later on. But at the Newtek level, I'm going to right click and choose Properties, and then go into the Security. And here I'm going to add my account to this security on here. In your environment, if you're using a dedicated render account that's on the network that multiple individuals use, this is where you would add them to the permissions on the computer itself. So I'm going to click Edit, click Add, and now I've added my account to the network permissions. Make sure it has Modify Permissions. I'm going to click OK, and it's now going to update. So this may take a while depending on the number of folders you have and the number of files that are in your directories. This went really quickly because it's a default installation. So that's the first step. The next step that we want to do is actually create a network share. So if I go to the folder itself that I'm going to be running LightWave out of, in this case it's 1.2, I'm going to right click on that particular folder and choose Properties, go to Sharing, click on Advanced Sharing, and share this folder. So you can name this whatever you want. Due to the number of versions I run, I typically call this the control and then 2019. But you can name it whatever you want, but this is what's going to be used for setting up your plugin information within LightWave itself, and then also for the network rendering controller. If you want to put comments, you can. Under permissions, if you need to limit access to this share, I would recommend removing everyone and then simply adding the users or groups that you want to give access to this particular share. But this should also have the account that's used for the network render controller nodes that are on your network. So this account as well will have change permissions. So just know that it's Control 2019 is the name of the share. So with those things set, we're now looking at the directory structure of LightWave. So one thing that is not here is a folder called config. So I'm going to add a folder, call it config. We're going to be transferring the configuration files from the user directory into the config file here so that our network render controller can pick up those same configurations. However, we haven't yet configured LightWave to be using the new share on the network, so we're going to do that next. I'm going to load up layout, and then we're going to look at the default path. And now that LightWave is loaded, I'm going to load up the default content directory. And notice right now I'm using my user account. So this is where we want to change it to this network share that we just set up. So this requires the knowledge of the host name. In this case, it's going to be the name of the workstation I'm using. And again, this would be the network render controller master system. And here's the share I just set up, which is Control 2019. I'm going to click on here, and notice we don't have any content directory. So I'm going to create a content directory, and this is going to be empty. What I'm going to do here is take the UNC path, which is a network path for Windows Network, and I'm going to come back in here into the content directory, and I'm going to replace the default. I'm setting this up so that LightWave now uses the UNC path on the network, and this is going to impact how nodes are set up. Again, this is one way to do it. I know there are a few other ways of using a dedicated file share and drive path to it, but I found that this way in this new environment for 2018 and 2019, it works pretty well for me. And again, I'm just the individual using LightWave at my organization, so I'm not having to configure for multiple users. Your situation may be different, in which case you may have a slightly different path here. Know that if you use a dedicated drive path like an X share name, that X share name will also need to be configured on all of your nodes. So when I use just a UNC path to this location, I don't have to do any other configuration at the node level. The nodes are using a UNC path and no configured file name or share name for a drive letter. If I go into my content directory, notice I don't have anything here, and that's fine. I'm going to create the directories and then come back, and now we see that they've been created. The reason I want to do this is I'm going to copy some of the content into this location so that we can load up one of the sample files and use it for testing out the network render controller system with the nodes. The next step of the process is to make sure we have the config files for LightWave added to the config directory. This will allow the network render controller to pick up the configurations from this directory via the share, but we don't yet have that information copied over from LightWave. So we just configured LightWave the way we wanted it to, so I'm going to now go to the user account. I'm going to go to Newtek, LightWave, the version we're using, and look at the config files. So the two files that we need to copy over are the LightWave version we're running, the config file for that, plus your extensions. So you're going to find the extensions down here. So these are the two config files that need to be copied. And once they are in here, this is where the network render controller will now pick up the configurations for LightWave. For ease of use in a Windows 10 environment, if this control folder is what I'm using, I'm going to take this and connect it to my quick access, so I just have to click once to get here. I find that that's very handy. You don't have to do it this way. Your teams may have network shares assigned by a drive letter on your system. So with that in mind, we have the configs in here. We have the content directory, we have the plugins directory available, and that's all we need now to do the setup. Permissions are already set, we have the network share configured, and so the last thing we're going to do is set up one of the scenes. I'm going to load a scene, and this is going to be the PBR file for the Copper Dragon. It loads fine here, so I'm going to hit save. Save scene. Notice that the warning is now showing that it's being saved from the UNC path. And that is it for LightWave. So now we're going to look at the LightWave Network Render Controller software. This is the 1.2 version that's installed on this particular system for this demo. And I already have a number of nodes that are configured on the network to assign to scene files that I want to render out. But the config directory path and the shared plugin directory path are blank, and this is what we need to fill in first. So the config directory is going to be the UNC path that we created earlier with the config file. I'm going to copy that and paste it in here. Notice I have the config files in here. I am now going to assign a scene to this. I'm going to click Add Scene, go to the control folder, go to Content, Scenes, PBR, Copper Dragon, and open up the Copper Dragon file. To validate that the setup is accurate, I'm going to drag and drop a node over the scene file. And the image output directory on this particular scene file is set to the location that the person that created the scene for Newtek last saved it. So I'm simply going to replace it with a path that I created called renders in the content folder. And I'm going to go ahead and start the node. So part of the validation is that the node should load the scene and start rendering. And so we see it go through the cycles of being initialized, loading the file, and then being told what frame to render, and then rendering the frame. So at this point, if one node makes it to the render stage, then this should be sufficient for the other nodes to complete. So I will wait for this particular frame to finish before we can validate that it is indeed working correctly. So while it's rendering, notice that this particular node version is 2019.1.2. Most of my other nodes are all running the same version, in this case 2019.0.3. And this is something to be careful of. You do want to make sure that all of your render nodes are the same version, because occasionally there are changes made to the render engine that may output images that differ slightly, enough to cause jitter. So one point of advice is just to make sure all the nodes are the same version. So it just finished rendering the first frame, and I'm going to open up the render folder to see if it was rendered properly, and I do see the file here, so I'm going to double click on it and validate that it looks like it should. And there you go. I see that that did render it. One thing to keep in mind is that if you create the render folder in your content directory and it does not save, just make sure you go to the properties of the folder and make sure that it's not read-only, because occasionally that may block you from being able to write the file to this location. It's not always the case, but one point to look at. So with that in mind, the render controller looks like it is set up now correctly. I'm going to stop the node, and that completes this part of the setup for the network render controller. One thing to keep in mind in a Windows 10 environment where you're using a workstation as the network render controller is that Windows limits the connections to 20 connections. So that typically means in my environment, I may have up to 19 render nodes available to communicate, plus another machine that I can connect to work on the files for my main workstation. All of these network render nodes do need to be on the same networks. So that may be an issue if you have disparate networks that you have different farms running on. So the next part of this video will now cover how to install and configure the network render node on another workstation. I'm going to be using the 2019.0.3 installer, and this will cover versions 2018 and 2019 since the setup for network render nodes was introduced as of 2018. One of the primary considerations that you want to have for your nodes is running the same version of LightWave. In this case, I'm adding a .0.3 version to my farm since I have that same version set up on all my other nodes. So I'm going to go through the standard installation process for LightWave that we're all familiar with. If you're new to LightWave, then this is what you typically will experience during the installation process. So on the first screen, I'm going to click Next, accept the user agreement that I've read previously. It hasn't changed much, and most people don't ever read this, but it's fine reading. Feel free, get some coffee and sit down and have a good read. If not, click Next. Important notes, you can read those if you want. The directory path will be wherever you would like. This is the default. I'm simply going to copy this into memory because I want to keep my log files here as well. During your setup selection, click on Render Node. This is going to set up the installation for rendering. Now you can use the advanced options if you wish. In this example, I'm going to use that because I would like to configure everything about the setup for this render node. One of the awesome features that 2018 introduced was the ability to run this as a Windows service. I highly recommend doing this because at least in my environment, we have Windows updates that restart computers during the night, and some of the render nodes get restarted, and if this wasn't an option, then I'd have to log back into those workstations and restart the services. By having it set up as a Windows service, it will automatically start. But as a Windows service, you do need to have an account that this runs under. I'm going to click Next, and you have three options. You can use an existing user account, which I recommend. You can use the network service account, recommended for normal use, as it indicates here, or a system account. If you use a network or system account, just know that whichever option you use here, that service will need permission back on the master controller system to write files and read files over that network share we set up. So that may require some additional playing around with permissions. I'm not going to cover that in this video. I always use an existing user account, which I recommend. In my particular case, I use my user account since I'm the only LightWave person here, and so I'm the only one impacted. It just makes it easy for me to manage permissions and setting this all up. If you're in an environment that has multiple users, then it's likely recommended that there's a service account already created in Active Directory, and so you could use that here as well. One of the downsides of using my account is that when my password changes, I have to go and update the password on all of the nodes. Not a big deal. I don't use this every day in my environment. In your environment, if you're using a dedicated account, those passwords typically don't change on a daily basis or weekly basis, or every 90 days, or every 180 days, or every 360 days, based on your IT policies in the environment. But if you have a dedicated account, if the password doesn't change, then you don't have to come back in here to the nodes and update the service password within Windows Services. With that being discussed, I'm going to click Next. And under the account name is where you would put in the account name for your service. Typically, it would be domain/username, in which the username is the name of your service account. You either have this or can get this from your IT department if they've set it up. This may be known. If you're in IT and setting this up for your animation team, you're the one that sets all these things up and you make it known that the service is available. However you handle management of the password, that's up to you. But in this case, I'm going to type in the password for my account. So the next section is how you deal with diagnostic messages. I typically choose a log file and just have warnings and errors are included. I've copied this path previously so that I could put it here, and I just type in nrc.log. Now, in using this for 2 years, I haven't yet ever seen any information here, since the rendering systems typically render well, and I haven't had many issues with it, and there hasn't been anything reported in this log file. This is the base fallback port. It's going to use the Bonjour service. In your environment, you may have issues with that. I know from some of the posts I've seen online that this may or may not be an issue within environments. I've had conflicts on particular systems from time to time, but the NRC engine typically renders fairly consistently, and there'll be some troubleshooting needed if it ends up causing a problem. But here, select all the defaults, click Next. What you call the node is likely to be very important in your network, because if you have 20 render nodes, or 40, or 80, or fill in the blank, the way you name them is probably going to be very important as far as strategically being able to identify which nodes are what. In my case, I've come up with my own naming convention, and so this one may be node 22. Now I say node 22, and you said, well, you can't have more than 19 connections. That's correct. I do have up to 25 or 26 optional computers that I may have available at any given time, but I know that I can't run any more than 19 at a time on a given scene file in my environment. The nodes I have available to me can fluctuate based on usage in the environment. So in this example, it includes the host name of the computer, and this is my preference. I'm putting in the version as well, so that I know what version I'm installing on this particular node. This does need to be unique though. So if you have other nodes in the environment, if you have one with the same name, you're going to likely have issues, not only from a functional standpoint, but just practical. Like if you're looking at a name and there's two that the same one, unless there's something in the system that lets you know this, or you're tracking it some other way, it may become very difficult. So here I'm going to click Next and Next. So this will go through the standard installation process. The rest of this is the same as if you were installing the standard LightWave package with the typical installation. So it takes 3 to 5 minutes depending on your computer speed and drive speed. So while this is going through the setup, there is a local security policy now that you do need to update. The account that you've now used for this service needs to have the ability to log on locally as a service. By default, it is not there. So this may require some involvement from your IT department, but if you have access as a local admin on the server that you're setting up the node on, you can click on the Windows icon and type in local sec, and you're going to see local security policy. So you typically want to have this done by the time LightWave finishes installation, so we're going to see how well we do. So under local policy, user rights assignments, you want to scroll down to log on as a service. I'm going to double click here. This is the default setting on most computers, and this is where we're going to add a user or a group. This is where you're going to add that same user account for the service being used. It could be a service account that you've set up for all your render nodes, but in this case it's my account, so I'm going to hit OK, and that's all I have to do. As long as it can log on as a service, we'll see that the LightWave network render node is now going to automatically start. If at the end of this installation you get an error saying that it couldn't start the network render controller service, then the reason for that is the service account that you've used in the setup hasn't been added to the local security policy. So just keep that in mind. If you get the error, go back into local security policy, click on the Windows, type in local security policy, local policies, user rights assignments, scroll down and log on as a service. Don't put the account in deny log on as a service, because then it won't be able to start at all. So keep in mind that log on as a service is what is required. And that service account also needs to have access, both read and write permissions, to the network share that's on the master control system that we had set up earlier. Permissions are typically one of the pain points of setting up something like this, and that you have to have permissions in multiple areas. You can see that we have a local policy here we have to update for it to run as a service. If it gets to this point and finishes the installation without the error showing up, you're good to go. Click Finish. So we know now that the service is running. We want to validate that. I'm going to click on the Start menu and click Service, and you want to click on the Services app. This is going to confirm that the LightWave Network Render Controller service is running. So we're going to take a look at the service settings really quickly here. In this list, this is alphabetized, so I'm going to click on L on the keyboard to take me to the L's, and you're going to see the LightWave NRC service. So this is where you have the automatic startup. You can start and stop it. The logon, you'll see that it's right here. This is the account that you set up when you first did the installation. And if the password changes, this is where you would have to come and change the password. If you do, it's going to require you to stop the service and start the service to pick up that new password. My recommendation is anytime you stop this service and there is an active network render controller on the network, leave it in a stopped state for about 5 to 10 seconds. This lets the network render controller go through its process to identify that the service is stopped. It removes it from its queue. Once it's removed from its queue, then you can start the service back up, and then it'll pop back up in the network render controller. If you do it too fast, then the network render controller doesn't know that it's had some changes, and it could cause network rendering issues with this particular node. I haven't had that issue since I've started doing that. So that validates that the service is running. The last thing you'll want to do on your network render node setup is to verify that the plugins are correctly there. So if I go to Program Files, Newtek, this is my 0.3 folder. I'm going to go to Support and go to Plugins. So here's the default installation of plugins. And for this particular node, it's going to be connecting to a network render system I set up in the past. And this is my primary one. So if I come over here to my Support Plugins directory, I see that I have a number of folders. The DBW and the DP plugins are on the controller but don't exist on the node. So this is the last main thing that you'll need to make sure does get copied over. You want to have any of your special plugins match on your node so that when the scenes get copied and loaded on your node, that it has access to all of the plugins. So now that the plugins are copied, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. And that's it for setting up the network render node. So now that we have the network render controller configured and we have a network node, I'm now going to go into LightWave to show you how to set it up so that you can prepare your scenes and your objects for network rendering. So here we have a default scene with no objects loaded. And remember, in the configuration for the preferences, under your drive path, we already have the content directory set up to use the network share that we created in the first part of this video. That's very important because that's where we're going to be getting our objects from. And this is a path that's going to be inside of our LightWave scene file that will be distributed across all the nodes. So it's important to have this set correctly. So I've created a few simple objects here and I'm going to load them into the scene. And by default, it's already taken me to the object folder within the content directory. I'm going to load up the ground file. I'm going to load the box file and move it over. And I'm going to load up the ball file. I'm actually going to make this a little bit smaller. Turn on VPR so we can see what we're looking at. The next step, I'm going to apply some simple surfaces to these objects. I'm going to hit F5 to get to the surface editor. So for the ground, if you want to, you can use the node editor to apply surfaces to this. I'm going to hit the F8 key to bring up some default surfaces. And we'll choose a green matte plastic. So for the ball, I'm going to apply a different surface. Now granted, for a test, this would generate a lot of additional render time on the render farm, but it's going to make it look pretty. The front will be a different surface. So we can see here that we have surfaces applied, but we don't have any images applied. And that's where this next step is going to come in, because this is going to be important in how images are applied to your objects. So I want to apply an image to the surface, so I'm going to go to the image editor and click load. Now this is still pulling from the network share using the images folder underneath the content directory. I'm going to go to effects and cloud fractal. So I'm now going to apply this to the right side polygon here on this box. I'm going to open up the surface editor. For demo purposes, I'm just going to change this from principled to standard. If I go here to the texture map, I'm using the same image map I just loaded up. And I'm applying it right now as a cubic projection, but I could, if I want to, make it a planar since it's just one polygon on the surface. And now we see that the image is applied to this texture. So when you're setting up your LightWave scene and you've applied textures to your objects for the first time, you want to go to the Save menu and make sure you save all objects, or save the specific object that has the image. So one thing I've not done is set up any of my parameters. I'm going to go to the camera and choose Properties to make sure I set the resolution to what I want. I'm going to leave these as default. Under the Render tab, you can click on Render Properties. The General tab allows you to adjust the start and end frames of your animation. You have some rendering thresholds to increase the quality of your renders. Global Illumination allows you to set various characteristics of light. But the one I want to address here is the Output tab. So down here at the bottom, you can see the base save path is set to the UNC path we set in the first part of this video. That is also key. This allows all the nodes to save their images back to the host machine. And you can see that the directory path is going to put it in that renders directory that you saw me use earlier. You can give this any name you wish. By default, it'll say final render and then the frame number. So I'm just going to adjust it, and then if you need to, you can change the file formats. You can change the color space. I'm going to leave all those the default. The only thing I've changed is the base file name. So this scene has not yet been saved. So if I want to go to 120, I'm simply going to make an actual animation here so we can see it play through. So I've saved the objects. Any images that have been applied to the objects are now saved within the object files. I'm now going to save the scene. By default, it takes me to the scene directory, and I'm going to call this test frame. So here we have the LightWave scene file loaded up into Notepad so that we can look at the text values that are in this file. This is the file that every node will get, and this allows you to troubleshoot what the nodes see so that you can evaluate whether or not any particular part of the scene is not being able to be viewed by the node. All the way at the bottom of this file is the content directory. So you can see here that it's already set up to go to the host name of the master server on the network and then save its LightWave content directory to this path. Just above in this file, you can see that the Save RGB Images is now also set to that host name with the control folder. So I know that those are going to save in the correct directories. If I go up the file even further, I can start to see a lot of the different values that LightWave needs to render out files. But what I'm looking for are file paths. So you can see in this instance, the radiosity/radiosity.cache file is being saved to a relative path, and that's relative to the content directory. So I know that this is going to save in that same directory over the network. Further up, I see that an object is going to be loaded, and here's that ball object I created. This too is a relative path. So this will be based off of my content directory path at the bottom of this file. So I know this will load. Further up, I see that my box object is set up the same way. It's relative and it will load. So these are things to look for. If by chance you happen to load the box.lwo object, or whatever object you load, from the C drive, because that path differs from your LightWave content directory path, then it will save the full path here. When that happens, that file will not exist on the node machines and the object will not load. Anything else that can load into the scene will load. So you may have instances in which it renders fine on your main workstation, but when the nodes get to it, they don't see certain objects. This is a good way to double check. So I would just go through this LightWave file and verify that all the object paths and the object layers and where they're coming from look correct. And I would say that if you've set the content directory path correctly and loaded all your objects, images, and other files from that path, it should be safe to save the file and utilize it as is. I'm not going to save any changes to this. And I'll load this up on the render controller and see what it does. So now I've loaded the network render controller and I'm going to add that test frame scene to this file. Depending on how your computer was set up, it may take you to the C drive. And this is where having that quick access link really helps out. This took me to the LightWave directory where I can now click on the content folder, scenes folder, and load up the test frame. So this is the LightWave scene we're going to test, and we can see that the content directory is going from the host name. And again, this host name is the name of your computer that you're running this on. And the image output directory is going to the content/renders folder. And we saw that used earlier in part 1 when we were testing the network setup. So with this in mind, I'm now going to select a few of these nodes, add them to the test frame LightWave scene, and start selected nodes. Okay, so now we can see that the network render nodes are now rendering the files. And if any of your nodes have an issue at this time, then the log will show you potentially what the issue is with the particular render node. Occasionally there may be instances in which one of the render nodes is not configured correctly, and you may have to troubleshoot that at the node level. But as you can see here, we have the majority of our render nodes rendering the frames. So this would be done shortly. If I want to validate that the frames are being saved, I'm going to go back to that Control 2019 folder, Content, and Renders. So I can see now that the files are indeed being rendered. So here we go. We can see that the nodes are continuing to render. I'm going to keep recording. I will fast forward. All right, looks like it's finishing up here. The final frames are being rendered and saved. So we can validate now that the rendering has been completed and that the scene is set up. We can verify by going to one of the frames it's output, and this is exactly what we saw during the setup. And so this is completed. So this should give you a good idea about how to configure your LightWave scene for network rendering and then what you should expect to see once you load it here into the network render controller. So I appreciate you staying this long and listening to this video, and hopefully the information you've seen here can help you set up your own network rendering. There will be additional videos available that will go into certain configurations and certain environment types. They'll be much shorter, but this one gives you the detail of what it's like to set up the network render controller and the environment within Windows 10. And since the frames were rendered out, here's the final video. I know it's not much, but it shows you that we've completed the process from start to finish and that we're ready to go. So good luck on your next scenes and have a good day.